Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in August of 2015, the defendant, Brian Flatoff, was arrested for a felony offense in Outagamie County. And after his arrest, he had contacted an acquaintance of his, Vance Dalton, to see if he could get him to post his $3,000 cash bond. Vance was a working man, a family man, didn't want to put up the money, maybe didn't have the money to do that just out of pocket, so he negotiated with the defendant to take his motorcycle and he put it up for collateral on a loan to secure his bail. And he was able to get that loan for $4,500, and he put up the $3,000, and he gave the defendant the remaining $1,500 cash. In exchange, Brian Flatoff signed over the title to his motorcycle. Now, this is not going to be a trial regarding who's the owner of the motorcycle. The defendant began to dispute this and how Vance Dalton came into possession of this motorcycle. But this is only relevant for the background information as to why on the morning of December 5th, 2015, the defendant armed himself with a firearm, a 9mm MAC-10 style pistol, 2 33-round full magazines and 2 daggers, and went to the Eagle Nation Cycles shop in the city of Neenah, here in Winnebago County, Wisconsin. Leading up to December 5th, beginning in about October of 2015, the defendant started sending Vance Dalton letters, calling him, demanding to have his motorcycle back. And Vance was refusing this because he was on the hook for the $4,500 loan, and essentially said, if you can put up the money for it, pay me back, you can have it back, which the defendant apparently could not do, and his phone calls became progressively more threatening throughout the month into November. The defendant began threatening Vance Dalton's life. He began threatening to kill him, his children, his wife, if he did not get the motorcycle back. This proceeded to, it was November 23rd, Vance Dalton wrote a letter to the Outagamie County judge advising him of these threats and essentially asking that the bond be revoked. Now, unfortunately, as we've seen recently across the country, following acts of gun violence, we uncover that there was dire predictions that were not followed through, and such was the case here. Because on the morning of December 5th, 2015, approximately 8:55 a.m. or so, Vance Dalton was at home cooking breakfast for his children when he received a phone call from Ryan Motorson. Ryan Motorson had gone down to the Eagle Nation Cycle shop that morning, as he would on a typical Saturday morning, to see his friend Michael Funk, to give him a Christmas card, to chat with his friends, and to begin working on motorcycles. And while Ryan Motorson was down there working on a motorcycle, about 8:50 or so, somewhere around that time, him and Michael Funk heard a pickup truck pull up to the rear door of Eagle Nation Cycles. Now, this was a little unusual for them because the rear door is where people would come and drop off bikes, pick up bikes or parts or something of that nature. And so Michael Funk went outside the back door into the alley to see who was there. While Ryan Motorson was working on a motorcycle, moments later, he observed Michael Funk re-enter the Eagle Nation Cycle shop, hands in the air, and being followed in by Brian Flatoff, who was armed at this point with a 9mm pistol, pointing it at Mr. Funk and taking him back inside the motorcycle shop. Once inside the shop, the defendant almost immediately ordered that they call Vance Dalton at home and get him down there. Brian Flatoff had come to retrieve his motorcycle, but at this point that wasn't enough. He also had come to kill Vance Dalton. And when he ordered Ryan Motorson to make that call and get him down there, this is where he engaged in this conspiracy to commit that first-degree intentional homicide. Unwillingly, but having no choice, Ryan Motorson made the call, told him Flatoff's down here, he wants you to get down here, but he secretly, quietly, was whispering to him, don't come, he's got a gun. And Vance Dalton then called 911, and he had 2 lines open. Now he has one call open to 911, the other to the Eagle Nation shop, and he could hear the defendant telling people, if he doesn't get down here, I'm going to start killing people. I'm going to kill his wife. I'm going to kill his children. He can hear this, and he's reporting it to 911. Now that morning on December 5th, 2015, Officer Jonathan Kufel was off duty. He is the head of the Neenah Police Department SWAT team, and he was called into duty that morning approximately 9:11 a.m. And upon arriving on scene with his SWAT gear, he began assembling a team when he was provided notice that Brian Flatoff had announced that he was going to start killing people in 5 minutes if Vance Dalton did not get down there. And at that time, the decision was made to form what law enforcement calls a hasty team. A hasty team is a dangerous situation or scenario for police because it's a team that has to effectuate an immediate entry to try to rescue hostages without having the ability to do any type of research on the layout of the building they're entering, the floor plan, or to get any type of background information on the hostage taker or the hostages. But at approximately 9:42 a.m. that morning, the hasty team, led by Lieutenants Tyrone Thompson and Sean O'Bray, and then Officer Craig Hoffer, followed by Jonathan Kufel, and brought up the fifth man, Robert Ross, decided that they had to make entry at that time, based on the countdown. And when they opened the back door to Eagle Nation, which was relatively dark inside, compared to the bright sunny day it was outside, between the contrast in light and the limited visibility of the shield, that the ballistic shield the front man had, the two lead officers were unable to see that upon entering the back door, there was an open staircase immediately to the right that dropped down to the basement. And when the two lead officers entered the rear door of Eagle Nation, they immediately stepped to the right and they plummeted down to the basement below. When the two lead officers fell down into the basement, that left the third man in the hasty team stack, Officer Craig Hoffer, completely exposed without the protection of the ballistic shield and exposed to the defendant. And the defendant, despite his claims and statements this morning that he's pro-law enforcement and loves law enforcement, took a position up behind what's been called the L-shaped desk and immediately began firing at the police upon their entry, and they're yelling at police. And he shot Officer Craig Hoffer right in the head above the right eye. Now, fortunately, Officer Hoffer was wearing a ballistic helmet, and the bullet did not penetrate it. But he was injured. It hit just above the bottom rim, the lip of the helmet. He went down. He was screaming, "I'm hit." Officer Kufel, the next man in line, having seen the first two lead officers, from what he could tell, essentially vanished, seeing Officer Hoffer down on the ground yelling, "I'm hit," he himself is taking fire from the defendant, who continues to shoot, returned fire, and essentially, heroically, was able to extract not only Officer Hoffer, but pull the first two lieutenants that fell down the stairs out that back door and back into the alley. Once they were out in the alley, they got split up. Sergeant Angela Eichmann had taken a position on the opposite end of the alley where the hasty team had formed, and when she saw that one of them was down, she ran to the back door of Eagle Nation, helped Officer Hoffer go back up to the alley by Vicky's Hair Salon, which was the corner on the other end where they had taken a position, and Officer Kufel and Lieutenant O'Bray and Tyrone Thompson retreated back from the way they came where the team had initially formed up. Now, once having heard shots were fired, hostage negotiator Catherine Volker was able to make phone contact with the defendant, Brian Flatoff, who identified himself, and he was upset now at this point in time because the back door had been left open when the hasty team retreated. He began making orders for them to close the back door, and eventually, when Officer Volker said, "Well, I can't do that at this time," eventually the defendant ordered Michael Funk to close the back door. And Officer Volker could hear the defendant yelling at Michael Funk, something to the effect of, "If you make a run for it, I'm going to unload on your ass." And as Michael Funk approached the back door to close it, he went for it. And he tried to make a run out the back door, and the defendant, true to his word, fired approximately 5 rounds off at Michael Funk as he made his escape. Now back up the alley where Sergeant Eichmann had brought Officer Hoffer and Officer Ross. She was checking on their condition. They were trying to figure out what they had just walked into. They weren't sure if they walked into a hostage situation. They thought maybe it was an ambush of some type. They were lured down there from the way that they almost immediately started taking fire upon entry and yelling police and yelling get down. And while they were trying to figure out what just happened to them and if Hoffer was okay, they hear the defendant unloading on Michael Funk. So they go back to a position, look down the alley, and at that time they're able to see Michael Funk crouching behind a pickup parked in the alley with a firearm. Michael Funk was armed during the hostage situation. He had never pulled the firearm out. He had concealed within his waistband under his shirt a .45 caliber stainless steel Kimber pistol. Not until Brian Flatoff shot at him as he tried to make his escape outside in the alley did Michael Funk pull out his gun and turn and face back towards Eagle Nation. So at that time nobody knew he was armed. Now, the officers, when they look down the alley, they see Michael Funk with his pistol out. They just heard the gunshots. Michael Funk is looking in the direction the officers believe towards where the first 3 members of the hasty team went, Officer Kufel, Lieutenant Thompson, Lieutenant O'Bray. They don't know if he's looking for them, who had done the shooting, if he was looking for other targets. Michael Funk turns to start running down the alley towards those officers, fearing for their lives, fearing for the people inside Vicky's salon, civilians in the street behind them. They opened fire, and they shot and killed Michael Funk there in that alley. And not until later did they realize that it wasn't the defendant, the hostage taker, but they had killed a hostage. In fact, before the officers opened fire, Sergeant Eichmann hollered, "It's him," believing it was the defendant. And after they'd shot and killed him, they radioed in, "Suspect down, suspect down." Now, shortly after that, the defendant eventually released the remaining hostages. And after an approximately 3-hour standoff, he laid down his firearm and surrendered to the police. And Special Agent Dennis Carroll later spoke with the defendant that day at the hospital where he was taken for essentially observation. And the defendant admitted to him that morning when he walked into Eagle Nation and saw what he still believed to be his bike, he fucking snapped. The defendant admitted that he went to Eagle Nation that day with an extended clip 9mm pistol. The defendant admitted that when he was there, to taking the hostages, to waving the gun, pointing at everyone, to ordering them to put his bike back together, to put it into his truck. The defendant admitted that when he went there that day armed with the 2 daggers, the 9mm pistol, that he was going to kill Vance Dalton. When further asked about that during the questioning, he stated at one point he could fillet Vance Dalton. He stated that he intended to cut his throat. He made it quite clear that he went there with the intent to kill him. The defendant also admitted that when the police hasty team entered the shop, he hit the floor, took his gun, and started shooting at them. And at the end of his confession, the defendant asked Agent Carroll, had anybody, something to the effect, had anybody been shot? And the agent's like, well, can't really answer that right now. Why do you ask? He goes, well, when somebody starts shooting like this, That's bound to happen. And he's correct. The defendant was right. When somebody started shooting like that, it's bound to happen, and it happened. And Michael Funk was shot and killed. The defendant, it was Brian Flatoff, who on that day, December 5th, who was released from custody on a felony bond with the condition he not commit any further crimes, that he maintain absolute sobriety. It was the defendant, a convicted felon, prohibited by law from possessing a firearm, that was a substantial factor in the death of Michael Funk. You know, tomorrow was promised to no one, and only the Lord knows if Michael Funk would be here with us today if the defendant had not gone down to Eagle Nations that morning armed. However, I will prove to you that but for the defendant going to Eagle Nation that morning, armed with that gun, armed with those daggers, wanting that bike to take hostages to kill Vance Dalton, but for that, Michael Funk would not have been gunned down in that alley behind Eagle Nation Shoppers Cycles on December 5th, 2015. And I will prove this to you beyond a reasonable doubt with the witness testimony from the people who were there, who survived this. But you're also going to be essentially taken there, and you will see and hear just about everything I told you went down that day through surveillance video from inside the shop, through police body cams, through squad car cams, through audio from the 911 call, through audio from the hostage negotiators recorded line. And at the end of this presentation of the overwhelming evidence of this man's guilt, I'm going to ask that you find him guilty of all counts charged. Thank you.